All right.
Yo, hello everybody. Welcome. It is Saturday morning at 9:01 a.m. We're a minute late, Danny. Sorry.
Ah, a
We
minute
are
late.
here today. Randall is traveling, so he won't be joining us, unfortunately, but we'll be doing it without him because there's three of us, so why not?
Duo today.
Yeah. How you doing this morning, Danny?
Doing well, doing well. It's been a long week, but another
Yeah,
good week. So gotta do what
likewise.
you gotta
Yeah.
do.
Got Thanksgiving coming up, if you're in the United States at least. Um, yeah, so big week coming up, lots of food to eat. But today we're talking about how to think like a programmer and problem solve, or at least some strategies for problem solving for beginners. So I mean, I guess to start, the reality is if you want to become a developer and a programmer, your job really is to problem solve like all day, right? Like
All it
people
is.
you yeah, that's pretty much all that it is. So you got to kind of be good at this if you want to be a good developer. Because most of what you're going to get is sort of like requirements from somebody like, hey, I want this to look like this, or I want it to do this. And then it's up to you to figure out how to make that work. So let's just get into it. What are some big problems that like you've run into, Danny, as a developer, and how do you sort of start the approach of solving those problems? Can you give us some examples, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, I think a good one that you just kind of hitting on was like on like the requirements that you get from people to like build the things for them that you're hired or you were hired to build. A lot of times you need to go back and get clarification because I run into this
Mm.
so many times with like literally every job I've done where, you know, I get requirements. Some are really clear and it's like crystal clear what you want. Others are like really vague. Like I'll give you an idea. Like this one I was working on, it was like basically it was a web app that builds forms for this company. And like, I was getting near the end. He's like, we want it out next week. He's like, but can you add images to these? And I was
Mm.
like, yeah, I can add images, but like, what do you mean? Like, how many images? What kind of images? Like, images
Yeah.
for what? Like, but that's what people say. They just say, can you add images? And give you no other indication of what they want. So like,
So
you
that's a
have to get
really good one.
clarification.
Yeah. So like I think I think what I'm understanding you saying is uh when you have a problem, make sure you define the problem very clearly, right? Because people
Yeah.
are just say, hey, can you just do this thing? Like I was in a meeting once and somebody was like, yeah, can you just add an edit button and then make all the stuff edit? And I was like, that's not how it works.
Be
So
awesome if it did.
yeah. Um, so defining like exactly what it is that people want is really good because that helps you figure out your next step, which is probably finding possible solutions for that. So I think
Well,
that's
that's
yeah.
just it too. In that situation, like I ended up sitting down with him for half an hour and finding out that he wanted to put like basically reference images on these forms. And
Mm,
so like we ended up with four on the form, so four options. But like I had to sit down with him to figure that out and then figure out where do you want these to be on the form. I mean, you really have to think about all of this because you're in control of everything. Like,
right.
if you think about like how the form's going to look, how it's going to be laid out, how many of this, how many of that, and then you have to code it, which means you have to build that. So you have to be able to
Yeah.
do that as well. Like,
Yeah,
that's the other
exactly.
side of it.
And that's
Yeah.
I mean, I think that goes back also sort of just to like clear communication, right? Because when we hear one thing, we can interpret that in a multitude of different ways. So having that really clear communication of pinpointing exactly what this person wants out of your development, right, is really important so that you know how to actually attack that problem. So I think that's a great one. So I would say anytime that you're problem solving, that's really step one is defining the problem. Like what are we trying to solve? Because otherwise you might be solving the wrong problem. Um, so yeah, that's a good one. And then how do you actually go about solving that problem?
Yeah.
I'm
I mean, this
asking.
is the other issue. Oh, you're asking me. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So, like, I mean, that's the issue, right? Once you know what the problem actually is, then you can start setting out, okay, so this is how I'm going to actually do it. But if once it's defined, it's way easier to figure that out. I can give you
Yeah.
another example too of like, you have to sometimes just isolate it too. Because, like, we were talking about this before we got on the live stream, but like, you
Yeah.
know, when you're a programmer, you're going to run into errors all the time. And a lot of times the only way to figure it out is to actually isolate the problem down. So actually like sometimes adjust your code, maybe turn things off. A good example is like I'm not necessarily an IT person, like,
Mhm.
but in this one job I got stuck with setting up a server, and that's not normally what I do. So a lot of configuration stuff. And the last issue I was having was with the SSL certificates. And
Mm.
what I had to do was in order to figure out, because I thought it was the VPN, but I wasn't sure. And the only way to figure it out was to shut the VPN off briefly
Oh,
and
yeah.
then try it. So I was trying to isolate that issue, right? Because then I knew if that was the problem, then I can attack it from that angle. If not, it's something else in my configuration that's the issue, right? And that gives me a lot of insight into like how to actually go about now solving it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I can relate to that. A lot of times I end up like so I do a lot of front end development, right? So I'm like visually sort of adjusting what's on the screen. And so sometimes what I use is either comments to comment out code when I think it might be causing the issue, right? So you can
Yeah.
comment out a piece that you might think is causing like an error and then see if that error replicates itself after you've commented out. The other thing that I do is, particularly with design, is throwing a big fat border around a div or something like that so you can
Yeah.
really see what you're adjusting, right? Because just like not knowing what the problem is or not clearly defining the problem, if you can't clearly define the error, that's also an issue. So understanding like what it is that you're actually manipulating and where the error is really important too. So that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think to your point too, like if you're really unclear about what the issue is, you can also throw a debug in so that, like we've done this in React, you can put a
Yeah,
line of code in so that it'll run and then stop at this point and then throw back a bunch of information that you can use.
exactly.
And I think, it's hard. I mean, at first it is very hard. I know we were talking about this earlier too. Like, I know for me personally, like the error codes are confusing at first.
Yeah,
When you're a beginner, it's not clear what's breaking what,
yeah,
and like but it gets easier as you go. And I think a lot of times, problem solving is just copy and pasting the error code, throwing it in Google or something, and trying to figure out what it means. It
yeah.
amounts to that.
I want to say something about that too, because you brought up a good point. When you're a beginner, you see a lot of errors, and I think they're very scary. At least for me, when I was a
Yeah.
beginner, I was like, "Oh my god, everything just turned red." And usually it's not just like one error; it's 10 in a row because you
Yeah.
break like 15 things when one thing breaks. And I think when I was very new, I would actually try to avoid getting those errors, right? So I would just not code things or make it perfect, right? And that was, I think, sort of wrong mentality, right? Because having those errors actually tells you what's working and what's not working and where to look, right? So
Yeah.
typically every error is going to say, what line of code is broken and even what like character indexed in is where the broken code is or the error is. Um, and then the other thing too is errors like teach you a lot about how
Yeah.
to be better at coding, right? There's so many things that I've learned from errors that nobody ever taught me because there's just so many intricacies to a library or different languages that it's really hard to teach every single piece of every coding language. But those errors teach you like where to go to find the solution. And go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say, and another important thing with that, which I think to your point is like you need to know what errors are gonna actually come up to so that you can actually escape them if you need to, or do a try
Yes.
except block, right? So like a lot of
Yes.
times, when you put something in production, you don't want your software throwing back these huge error codes with all this information. So, you turn that off, but you need to be able to handle errors, and error handling using like try except blocks, things like that is an
Yeah.
important part of the process. And in order to figure this out, sometimes you have to break it. If you don't know what the error is going to be, you just have to see what they are, and then you can work around them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. For new developers who haven't used this yet, like try accept or try catch is basically a way to use your program to when you don't know exactly what the response is going to be. For example, you're fetching data or something like that. There might be errors that are outside of what you'd normally expect, like the internet, you don't have a great internet connection, or the server is not running, or something like that. That can throw errors for you that you wouldn't normally think would happen, right? Because you're just expecting the program to work perfectly. And those try catch blocks or try except in Python are a great way to handle those errors because you are going to have that. And there's always going to be edge cases for whatever you're building. So that's a good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you an example too. Like I remember on the one thing I was building, like, you have forms, so it's pulling data from a database, but all those fields might not have information. And so
Mhm.
when I was assigning them to variables, some of the variables would be like none or null or something like
Mm.
that, right? And so then when you write, you have to write a try except block. They call it in Django, it's an unbound local error, which means that you have a variable that's not assigned to something, right? But you have
Yep.
to catch that, otherwise the whole thing breaks, right? And you don't want it to break in operation or in production. So you catch it, you accept it, and then you pass by it. So you say, just don't worry about it if this is the case, or do this or do that, you know?
Yeah. There's a really cool trick in JavaScript that I love using, which is so when you're when you're pulling data from an object, you can use dot notation, but you can put like a question mark before the dot, and that just handles like if it's not there, just ignore that. It's
Yeah,
awesome.
which is
It's like
great
the
though.
best thing ever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you get so many errors when you have, when you're expecting that there's a piece of data there, which this happens a lot, right? Um, when people fill out a form, they don't always fill out every field in the form. And sometimes you don't want to force them to because it may not be important, right? It may not be
Yeah.
required. But that means that there's empty data inside of your like database somewhere. And so when you go to pull that, it's like your program's going to be, confused that there's not something there. So
That's
under
another side, error handling too, is like a situation like that. Do you have a default data that you put in,
yeah.
or do you choose nothing and let it go with like null or none or something? Like, I mean, these are decisions you have to make that are really sometimes, it takes a lot of time to figure out.
Yeah. So all right, so we sort of defined, you know, we have to define our problem and then we have to find ways to handle, edge cases and errors. But when we get these errors, what are some strategies that you use to actually solve them, particularly if you don't know the solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of errors you don't, right? Because you, especially when you're
Yeah.
starting out, oh my God, it's you get
Yeah,
these
you don't
errors
know
like,
anything, right?
no, you don't. I think like to your point though, they are helpful. I mean, I always try to do like, I usually have pretty much three things that I do that usually works really well is like one, I'll go to documentation because if the documentation's good, and depending on like some of them are better than others. Like I know Django's is really good. React's is very good, I think,
Yep.
by and large. They usually have they'll have a good list of the errors and like the kinds of errors that can be thrown, and that can give you really good insight into just like one, error handling, but also just like what the error means and why it's being thrown, right? So documentation's good. Just Google it. So cut and pasting in Google is very helpful.
Yeah. I
And
like that.
now,
Right.
yeah, now because like I think, yeah, Google also finds some answers sometimes. But I think like probably the best thing now is just using AI too, because you have
Yeah.
ChatGPT, especially really good. You have a Copilot if you pay for the service on Git.
Mhm.
There's there's all these different things out there now, and they can be really helpful as well. But you also have to keep in mind that like I think AI is great, but it doesn't always give you the correct answer. It can get you there though.
Yeah.
And I think so sometimes you do have to like, don't expect to just give you like, you put this, what's this error? Sometimes it's great. It says this error is this is how you fix it. Other times though, you have to do a lot of work or it's only going to get you kind of halfway there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I use those pretty often. I actually tend to lean towards AI because it's faster. A
I
lot
do
of
now
times,
too. Yeah.
yeah. A lot of
Yeah.
times, like a lot of times when I run into errors now, there are things that I've come across before. So I can read. Obviously, the first thing you want to do is just read what the
Yeah.
error description is, because that usually gives you a really good idea of what's going on. And it tells you generally exactly in your code where it's breaking, unless it's like,
Sometimes too, sometimes it's exactly what the problem is too. Cause like
yeah,
there's issues where like I misspelled something and
mhm,
like it'll throw an error and it says, line 222, this document, you know, we don't
yeah,
know what this is basically. Like this
yeah.
isn't a word.
That happens to me often too, because if you copy and paste code and then you're like, don't change a variable name or something like that. That happened to me last week where I was copy and pasting code and then um, I didn't change the variable name, so it was like, what is this variable? You didn't define it here. So yeah, that happens a lot. But yeah, I like your point. So like, look at the error first, figure out, okay, is it something that I can handle? And then yeah, I generally tend towards AI, like I said, because it is faster, but sometimes it's not always the best way. And sometimes it's a little bit more complicated. Like I've been in scenarios where I'll put an error in chat GPT or something and it'll give me like 10 different possible solutions
Yeah,
because it just doesn't have enough information either, right? It needs to
yeah,
see like your code. So excuse me. So sometimes adding a snippet of your code is also helpful in there as well. But something else that I tend to do a lot if if I'm just running into something, and sometimes it's more than just, you know, when we talk about problem solving, it can be more than just a simple error like you're missing a semicolon or something like that. It could be, problem solving could be how do I manipulate this data or how do I make this program run in a certain way? And so I talked about this a little bit last week, I think, but I like to take a break from staring at the code because it lets my mind sort of run over the problem a little bit and find, particularly when it's, like I said, not something that's just like there's a semicolon missing. Like when I'm talking
yeah.
about how do I manage like this data? Like I built this basically two-sided marketplace at one point, right? And I was trying to figure out, I wanted some people to be able to see in the marketplace like certain data and other people not. And so I had
Like a
to like,
paywall almost, kind
yeah,
of.
exactly. Yeah. And so I had to sort of manipulate that in my head. Like, how do I manage, what user role can see what, and how do I split this information, the data that needs to be like available to anybody, the data that can only be available to people who have paid, things like that. And it took me a really long time to sort of work that out in my head. And a lot of that was done not sitting in front of my computer. It was done while I was out, and I just sort of let it like let my brain mull over it,
Yeah.
as I was going throughout my day. And that's a lot of times like the best way to solve these problems, right? Is just letting your subconscious do the work for you.
Yeah, because it does though. And I think the other thing, I mean, something
Yeah.
I've learned too over time, like when I first started out, like I would just sit down and like code, and just try and like code. And but as you get, and that's fine, like especially when you're doing like simple beginner stuff like Hello World or like these
Yeah.
simple things, you can just kind of code straight through it. Um, but as you get going, especially when you take on jobs, like sitting down too and just defining what you're doing and how
Mhm.
you're going to break it down at the beginning is so important. Like we forget this because you think like, oh, I'm just gonna make a web app. Blah, I'll just down,
Yeah.
but really like, you know, the best way to program, because it is problem solving, is also breaking your code up into small pieces. So you can solve
Yes.
those small problems that then build together to make the full web app or the full, website or whatever it is. And I think like that's one of the big things too, is like now I sit down and I'll like sketch things out. I'll
Yeah.
use some like,
That's
framework,
great.
like yeah, mock-up programs and stuff like Canva and stuff, and just like try and figure out like what's the best way to approach this and what's the best way to break this down into simple parts that I can actually manage it effectively.
Yeah, that's a great point. That was something that, it's not was something, it is something that I do often, particularly when building like a large app, is take a sheet of paper out because when you stare at code, it's very hard to visualize like what's going on, what pieces are actually
Yeah.
interacting with each other. So actually taking like a sheet of paper and drawing boxes or, this is the database, this is a user, and how they interact with different things and how data is passed back and forth, that can be so helpful. I know when I was doing that marketplace, I use that because I couldn't I couldn't visualize it with the code. I needed something that I could actually see in front of me to say, like, this is where the data is going. This is who can see it. This is who has access. And that was super helpful. I agree.
Yeah, and especially in situations like that, when you're talking about access too, because like there's so many ways to handle access. Like you might have a
Yeah.
paywall, you might have a designation where the user's like staff or employee or something. You might
Mhm.
however you want to do it, but there's lots of ways. And sometimes it just depends. Like, I was doing a job where like the company was small. They didn't have a lot of employees. So it made more sense for me to just add a field in a profile that designated that a certain way rather than using a lot of sessions and stuff because it's just there was only like a handful of people. But like if it was a larger thing, that would have been really not a good method. I would have went with something else. It's a lot more effective because you're dealing with a lot of people and it's just hard to manage that, right? And there can
Yeah.
be mistakes. So yeah, I think it's like to your point, you just got to figure out, the best way. And a lot of times it's not on the computer.
Yeah. It's not. Yeah, I was gonna ask you, do you use Stack Overflow? Because that used to be like the main way to solve problems, but I feel like it's dying very quickly.
Well, when we first started out, like I would like so whenever I Googled problems, Stack Overflow always came up. But the thing I found like is that like I found it frustrating to be honest, because like sometimes yes, there was very rare case. I'd say like 5 to 10% of the time I got a solid answer on Stack Overflow and a good explanation.
Yeah.
90% of the time though, dude, it didn't even answer my question. Or like they didn't like bother to even mention like that, like, this is like, operating system dependent or something. And like, so you don't even, it doesn't even get you close to solving it. It makes it more confusing.
Yeah, I agree. I don't really use it at all anymore. I used to use it a little bit, but a lot of times what you'd find was sort of outdated because just like our code, we change our code every day. So do all these libraries and frameworks. So it's really hard to keep like this ongoing sort of database of um, problems that are relevant, right? So you always get
Yeah.
something like Stack Overflow from like 5 years ago, and it's somebody solving the problem, but it doesn't
Yeah.
work that way anymore. So that's a huge issue. Yeah.
I
Um,
had that issue once with Django actually, where like I found a solution, but it was like Django, like 1 point something. And like turns out that was a security risk when you do it now. So it's like it doesn't work. Yeah.
You're like, great, I'm adding more errors into
Yeah.
my code
Yeah.
by trying to fix this.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, I think yeah, that's a pretty good overview. I mean, you're always going to run into problems as a developer, and I think something that's really important to understand when you're a beginner is that problem solving skills, particularly in software development, are learned. You don't like nobody was born an expert problem solver, but the way that you get better is by pushing yourself and breaking stuff and then figuring out how to fix it. I think there was somebody in the group today, right, who posted, I think it was Sohail. I think I'm sorry if I'm uh, saying your name wrong, but they posted about, they developed this website and then they looked at it on their phone and it looked all messed up, right?
Yeah.
And this is like a very common thing for beginners, right? You don't necessarily know what you don't know, right? It's an unknown unknown. So, how do you go about solving that problem? Like, how would you do that if you were a brand new developer? What would you do, Danny? You built a website and then you look at it on your phone and you're like, what the heck? All this text is on top of each other now.
Yeah, I would probably, I mean, I would probably go to Google or to ChatGPT for that first, just because the type of problem is not like necessarily, at least if you're thinking about it from a beginner's perspective, it's not like super clear why it's happening.
Yeah.
So one of those, but either of those would tell you pretty quickly that it's responsive web design because it's a very common
Yeah.
practice now, that design practice. So I think once you figured that out, I mean, either of those would get you in the right direction of, okay, so I need to make this responsive, and then trying to figure out how do I do that. And then going like documentation, AI will help you get there depending on what you're using.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's a great answer. So, like, the first thing I think I would do is really just try to formulate my question so that it's
Yeah.
clear, right? So, I built a website, but on a mobile phone it looks weird, something like that, and you either throw that in Google or ChatGPT or some AI, and I think you'll get a pretty quick answer, which is what you said, right? Is
Yeah.
responsiveness. And then what I would do at that point is I would look into that, right? So what does responsiveness mean? Because to you and I, we know the word responsiveness right away, right? We know
Yeah.
a responsive website means that when you collapse the view window down, that all the content on your website is going to adjust so that it fits in there. But if you're brand new, you may not know what responsive means. That's actually sort of deceptive to me. I feel like when I was a beginner, I thought responsive meant like you click a button and like something happens,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that may be like unclear. So understanding what responsive means and then how is that handled, right? Through CSS, or if you're using other libraries like Tailwind makes it super freaking easy
Yeah.
or Bootstrap. They make it really easy to handle responsiveness because you don't need to define the media queries. You literally just say like small, medium, large, extra large,
Yeah.
2XL, right? And then just change like the CSS for that. But I think that was a great question, and I love that people in the group are throwing that stuff in the group because they're not scared of being wrong, right? That's one of the
Yeah,
biggest
doesn't
things
matter.
as a problem solver is that you can't be scared to be wrong sometimes, because we don't like that's part of growing is not understanding things. So, credit to Sohail for
Yeah.
putting that in the group, and hopefully you get your problem fixed. I threw in the MDN docs for you, Sohail, but you can also just go in ChatGPT and say, "Hey, can you explain how responsiveness works in CSS and on my website?" And you'll actually get a pretty good description, and you can sort of go from there.
And stuff like that's fine too. It's like with responsiveness, you have to set the viewport in the meta section of the
Mm-hmm.
HTML. And if you don't know that, even if you do these other things, it won't work. So it's
Yeah,
like that's a good example too, where like it's a multi-step problem that you have to work through. But I think to
exactly.
your point too, like embrace problems because one, that's all we did was solve problems. And two, if you're not encountering problems, you're not growing, you're not learning. I mean, that's just the reality of the
Exactly.
situation. So just embrace them. Don't get upset by it, break things and then fix it and you'll learn how to do it better.
Yeah. I was listening to this book the other day by Brian Tracy. It was called No Excuses. And that was something that was really interesting was he was talking about how he was coaching somebody and on sales, right? This person was a sales leader and they were progressively getting better and better at sales, making more money. And then uh, this was somebody that had gone to one of his conferences. And then a few years later, he came back to the conference and he was like, your stuff doesn't work. I got to a point and I plateaued and I couldn't make any more money. And he said, well, what happened? Like when you plateaued, something happened there. And he was like, well, I changed jobs. And he said, well, what happened when you changed jobs? And he was like, oh, I get it now. I stopped learning. I stopped pushing myself. I stopped going to conferences. I stopped focusing on like learning new things. And that's so important, particularly as a developer, because
Yeah.
things change all the time, right? Anytime that you're like, I'm not learning something new, you're actually like going in the opposite direction, right? You're because everything's progressing every day, but if you don't progress with it, you're like stuck, you know?
Dude, that's what I got into it for. Like it's one of the scary things about development, which is it's constantly changing and you have to always learn. But it's also
Yeah.
the thing I like about it the most because like it's so easy to be in a job and to get comfortable and to stagnate. Like you're saying, just plateau because you're like, well, I'm good enough for this now. I don't have to do anything else. This is suitable. But you know what? Over time that sucks because you're
Yeah.
not doing anything new, you're not learning new things, you're not solving new problems, you're not growing, and it just sucks. And at least for me it does. And so like I really love development, but you gotta get used to it. It's a big
Yeah.
all part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So embrace the errors and embrace the problem solving because if you want to be a developer, it's something you're going to do every single day.
Yeah.
But that also means that you're going to become better and better and better at it every day. So yeah. So I think that's
Yeah.
pretty good for today. I hope that helped you guys in your journey as a developer and learning how to problem solve some of these issues that you'll run into. If you have any other issues, problem solving issues, and you have questions, throw them in the group. We love answering your questions, and it helps everybody in the group. We're now up to I think 212 members, which is pretty cool. We'll keep growing that to as many as we can get in here, so that we can all sort of learn from each other and grow. And that's one of the best ways I think to grow too is just by
Yeah.
working with people who are at the same level as you. Because if we were all senior developers in here and then you were just the one junior, you'd probably feel left out a little bit. And we don't
Yeah.
want that. We want everybody to embrace, your time here and explore software development as a group, because we become better that way. So
Yeah.
thank you guys for tuning in today. We'll catch you next Saturday for another live stream at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and keep problem solving.
Keep it up.
Good up, guys.